The noise is deafening. The woman can feel the physical vibration of 30,000 voices rumbling right through her. There's a heavy feeling in the air. A Toyota pickup truck slowly drives onto the grass, and inside the back of that truck is the woman. She is a 35-year-old mother of 5 named Zarmina. Underneath her blue burqa are 3 layers of dresses, not because she's cold, but because she desperately hopes those extra layers of fabric will soften the blows of the flogging that she is sure is waiting for her. A public punishment. She tries to look around, but her vision is completely restricted. It's dark and suffocating and blurry because her face is covered by a heavy, thick mesh. She can only view the world through a tiny, cross-stitched window of fabric. But she can hear everything. And judging by the volume of this massive crowd, one would think the home team is about to score the winning goal. And today, 30,000 people did come to the place that she is standing in. They just came for a different reason. But not the reason this place was intended for. Because this massive stadium was built by international support, meant to host celebrations, athletic triumphs, and community joy. Speaking of joy, joy was something Zarmina may have known during her childhood in Kabul, before the shadow of the Soviet occupation, and before being married off at 16 to a man who would become a Taliban police officer. Every single night, he beat Zarmina, almost ritually, and for nearly 20 years, Zarmina endured it. But one night, the violence reached a breaking point. Her husband was beating her so savagely that it became clear she wouldn't survive the night. In a moment of pure desperation, her 16-year-old daughter, Najiba, stepped in. To save her mother's life, Najiba grabbed a steel hammer and ended her father's life with it. In the West, a battered woman might have a real legal defense. Hell, she may have had more resources to leave him in the first place. In Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, however, there was only the cold, extreme, fundamentalist version of Sharia law. When the Taliban authorities arrived, Zarmina claimed she acted entirely alone. She was thrown into a dark basement cell in the Taliban-run prison, beaten with steel cables for 2 days to try to get her to give up her daughter. They locked her away for about 1.5 years, with her infant twins with her in the prison cell. And while she was locked away, her psychopath brother-in-law, who was a military member of the Taliban, took custody of her older children. And just weeks before her execution, he sold Zarmina's 2 teenage daughters into sex slavery for a total of 900,000 rupees. That's roughly $17,341 in 1999. Adjusted for inflation, this man sold his own teenage nieces into literal sex slavery for around $35,000. He pocketed the money and later used it to flee across the border when the US began their war on terror. Which brings us back to Zarmina being led out onto the arena on November 17th, 1999, still believing that she was only going to be whipped. But as she was forced to kneel, a tall Taliban soldier stepped up behind her with a Kalashnikov. Sensing that something was terribly wrong, she tried to flee. She was wrestled back to the pitch line where the Taliban soldier stood. He pulled the trigger. The Taliban thought they could keep complete control over the narrative of how they were running the country. They had banned television, outlawed cameras, and made themselves the sole enforcers of Afghanistan's reality. To them, a public execution, the first public execution of a woman, too, under their reign, was a blatant display of their absolute power. From the stands of Ghazi Stadium, the crowd was heard saying, "Allahu Akbar," God is great. It was a mandatory phrase of compliance, shouted by thousands of onlookers who knew that silence after this barbaric act that the Taliban had committed could absolutely become a death sentence for they themselves. But meanwhile, sitting right there in the crowded stands, was a different form of onlooker. A camera lens, to be exact. You see, looking through her own suffocating blue veil was a woman holding her breath, shaking a bit even. Because hidden beneath the heavy flowing folds of her burqa was a running video camera. That camera belonged to a member of RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. Founded in 1977 during the brutal Soviet occupation, RAWA had spent over 2 decades growing larger and larger in secret, finding incredibly brave but equally dangerous ways to resist. By smuggling that footage out of the stadium and into the international media, they showed the world the exact horrific reality that the Taliban was so desperately trying to hide from it. I'm Nicole Davenport, and this is Great in the Sack, when misogyny leads to mayhem. Now, as the name of the show implies, we take a look at the worst sides of patriarchy. I don't think I need to give a formal content warning every single episode anymore because, honestly, the mayhem is already implied. But for this episode in particular, we are looking at some pretty heavy things during the Taliban's reign and even during the US occupation. So, just a heads up on that. And before we get into the story, I want to share the main sources that made today's episode possible. I drew heavily from 2 incredible documentaries by journalist Sariya Shah, Beneath the Veil and Unholy War, which are vital for understanding certain aspects of the struggle of the Afghan people, and especially that of women under this regime. I'm also referencing a piece of smuggled footage that has been written about extensively, which is referred to as Zarmina's Story. You can also read about it on rawa.org. In fact, many of the aspects I'm speaking about today come directly from RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, who have been fighting for an equal, secular, and democratic Afghanistan since the 1970s, as I indicated in the beginning of the episode. Now, to give a little backstory on this organization, RAWA was founded by an Afghan activist named Mina Keshwar Kamal. Born in Kabul in 1956, Mina left her university studies to dedicate her life to organizing and educating Afghan women. In 1977, she founded RAWA to advocate for democracy and women's rights, later launching its publication Payam-e-Ihsan, which we will talk more about later in the episode. She also established underground schools and healthcare centers for refugees. Her fierce opposition to both Soviet forces and religious fundamentalists led to her assassination in Quetta, Pakistan, in 1987, at just age 30. But when we talk about RAWA, we have to keep 2 things in mind here. On one hand, they were one of the few organized groups bravely documenting atrocities and running underground schools for girls when everyone else was silenced. On the other hand, RAWA represents a very specific, radical, secular feminist perspective. They didn't represent every single woman in Afghanistan. As we know, groups of people are not monolithic. And this is especially true in conservative rural areas, where women often prioritized basic physical security over radical secular reform, which we will talk more on later. But because RAWA was one of the loudest, most organized voices, documenting the human rights abuses on the ground, which put them in immense danger, their records give us a vital, uncompromising window into this era. They've been telling the stories of the women in their land in a far more extensive and factual way than any mainstream journalist ever could. So, if you want to dive deeper into any of these sources, the entire list is waiting for you in the show notes. Also included in there are those 2 active petitions you can sign. With that being said, let's get started. In the last episode, we left off with the rising popularity of a certain populist jihadist that would go on to found the Taliban in the chaos left behind by the post-Soviet occupation. Now, I need to clear up a term that I used in the last episode, mujahideen. In the context of these episodes, they are those who fought against the Soviet Union's invasion. I kept it pretty broad, basically calling them resistance fighters, but it's actually a bit more complex than that. Think of the term mujahideen as a wide spectrum, not as a single unified army. The term covers a wide array of groups, different ethnic backgrounds, foreign backers, and different versions of Islam. Most of them were Islamists, meaning they wanted a state governed by their interpretation of Islamic principles. And most were also jihadists, which basically means that they were willing to use violence to achieve those goals. Now, when the Soviets were in the country, these factions were united by a common enemy, the Soviets. But once those Soviets left, that unity shattered due to the huge power vacuum that remained. And then the Second Afghan Civil War began, the first being after the ousting of King Amanullah in 1929 that we spoke of in the last episode. You see, the Mujahideen fragmented into competing warlord factions, which is why, during this time, these groups are literally referred to as warlords. This brings us again to the rising jihadists. Mullah Mohammed Omar. Omar had actually been a low-level fighter in the Mujahideen during the resistance against the Soviets. But when the war ended, and he saw his former comrades devolving into corrupt warlords, setting up illegal checkpoints, stealing from locals, and terrorizing the population, he felt like the struggle that they had all been a part of in fighting the Soviets had been betrayed. He retreated into a madrasa in Kandahar near the border, where he taught. And if you recall from where we left off last time, according to his own lore, he was eventually driven to action by the lawlessness of the warlords. He gathered his students, who were mostly disillusioned young men, many of whom were refugees from the Soviet war returning from Pakistan and also in the southern area of Afghanistan. And in September 1994, he started the Taliban. Again, remember that Taliban means students. To the desperate people in those regions who just wanted some sense of security and predictability to return to their land, the Taliban sounded at least like some kind of change. While there was resistance in rural areas, it looked very different than the organized underground schools that existed in the cities. In the villages, resistance was quieter and often oral. It happened in private social circles where information was shared and propaganda was debunked, rather than in underground literacy classes. But alongside that resistance, there were also women who actively supported different patriarchal structures, including the Taliban. This is where we see something called patriarchal bargaining, a concept developed by sociologist Denise Candiotti. It describes how women, living in a system where they have almost no economic or social power, will sometimes accept the rules of a restrictive system because it offers them a better chance at basic survival and security than the chaos that they currently live in. But in situations such as Afghanistan, it's about surviving. It's not really a free choice. And in rural areas, this bargain felt somewhat familiar. Since the Taliban were overwhelmingly Pashtun, their rules often aligned with the long-standing tribal codes, like Pashtunwali, as we spoke about in the last episode, which had governed these villages for generations. For many rural areas, the Taliban didn't look too different at first. They looked like a return to a rigid, albeit predictable, structure. But it wasn't just the rural south that welcomed a change. Since the east was predominantly Pashtun as well, it was much easier for the Taliban to establish control there. Although Herat in the west was culturally vibrant and had a relatively functional administration under the warlord Ismail Khan, the Taliban captured the region surprisingly fast. This was largely because Khan's overextended forces collapsed following a failed southern offensive, allowing rural hinterlands favoring the Taliban's strict law and order platform to isolate the city. Also, regarding most of these areas, it's not like these extreme restrictions on women, such as strict veil mandates, were entirely new, as fundamentalist Mujahideen warlords had already instituted similar anti-women ordinances prior to Taliban rule. Now, in contrast, the North mounted the strongest and most persistent resistance against the Taliban, united by a concentration of non-Pashtun ethnic minorities, such as Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras, who rejected their rule. More on that soon. Parts of the urban areas were just also kind of exhausted from decades of instability and war. People in cities like Kabul were being kidnapped, robbed at checkpoints, and subjected to sexual violence by various warlord factions, not to mention that the warlords were actively using rocket launchers to destroy opposing factions' areas. My point to all this is that when the Taliban arrived promising to disarm those warlords and clear the streets, many urban residents thought that sounded like maybe it could be a positive change. They thought they were choosing a path to peace. However, RAWA saw this situation differently. Because they maintained a secret underground network, they were already getting reports from rural areas about what the Taliban's rules actually looked like. The beatings, the total lockdowns, and the erasure of women from public life. While others were celebrating the end of the warlords, RAWA was already trying to warn people that this wasn't a return to safety at all. It was a transition into a deeper, more permanent problem. This order that the Taliban promised was really just propaganda to distract from what they really planned to do. And what the Taliban really planned to do slowly became reality after they began recruiting Tajiks and Uzbeks into their ranks. This expansion helped them seize parts of the country much faster, and in 1996, the Taliban finally were able to take Kabul. In around a year, they would formally declare the country's official name as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Anyway, their arrival triggered what we now call the Third Afghan Civil War, as they faced off against the Northern Alliance. Remember from earlier, the resistance in the north? Now, the Northern Alliance was less of a unified government and more of a desperate temporary truce. But truce between who? Well, at the top, the warlords. It brought together rival warlords who had spent years fighting each other during the Civil War, but were now forced into an uneasy alliance after losing their territories to the Taliban. On the ground, the alliance was made up of regular local fighters and ethnic minority communities who saw these commanders as their only shield against the Taliban. The resistance was centered in northern Afghanistan because the region was home to major ethnic minorities such as the Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras. To these communities, the Taliban were viewed as Pashtun supremacists, trying to impose southern Pashtun dominance over non-Pashtuns, which is sadly ironic, given that many of these Northern Alliance warlords had spent the Second Afghan Civil War terrorizing those very same non-Pashtun civilians. But with the Taliban advancing, people felt they would rather back the devil they knew. To some, the Northern Alliance was even seen as a potential savior, led by their charismatic commander, Ahmad Shah Massoud. But remember, they were all fundamentalists, both the Mujahideen turned warlords turned Northern Alliance and the Taliban. While Massoud is often framed as the lesser evil, he still legislated extreme veiling of women, and as I just implied, he still oversaw an army of men who targeted and murdered vulnerable groups such as the Hazara people, basically just because they practice Shia Islam instead of Sunni Islam. According to RAWA, the Northern Alliance was just a different side of the same coin. And for the women of Afghanistan, neither them nor the Taliban offered a future for Afghanistan. Meanwhile, back in the rest of Afghanistan, the reality of the Taliban began to set in. They began completely dismantling public life. Everything was banned: photography, paintings, movies, television, and music. Take cassette tapes, for example. They would rip the magnetic ribbon out of the cassettes and string the tape up on poles or lampposts in the middle of town. It was like a haunting public warning. If you listen to this, this is what might happen to you. Because being caught with a forbidden item could lead to brutal public floggings, imprisonment, or worse. It was also a message designed to make every citizen fear their own neighbor. This was a form of what's called cultural genocide. By banning these arts, they were trying to erase the very identity of the Afghan people so that they could have total control over their reality. For women, the restrictions were even worse. They were rapidly excluded from work, education, and public spaces in a way that was, at that scale, unprecedented. The Taliban even ordered women to black out their windows, essentially putting them under house arrest. They weren't even allowed to look out at the street, because also, the world outside is forbidden from seeing them. They were being turned into ghost stories in their own country. And as RAWA had warned from the very beginning, this peace was already becoming an inescapable problem. Now, in our last episode, we talked about Sharia as a system that, while already difficult for women to navigate, has historically fluctuated depending on who holds power. But the Taliban's version of Sharia law was something entirely different. Their rule was built on a very violent convergence of three beliefs and ideologies: a strict revivalist Deobandi interpretation of Islam, fused with the rigid Pashtunwali tribal codes, and an extreme ultra-Orthodox fundamentalism. With this combination, the Taliban created a state where the law existed solely to shrink existence, until there was no space left for anyone who didn't fit their narrow little definition of obedience. The laws that prohibited all these different things were the vice and virtue decrees, which were divvied out by the morality police. They were like tools used to turn their ideology into reality. From the blacked-out windows to the total ban on photography and music, the decrees aided in the ultimate dismantling of society. And while the men were certainly policed and punished under this regime, for women, these decrees functioned as a weapon of total erasure. We've already touched on the punishments, public floggings, the lashings, the imprisonment, but I have to be clear about the ultimate reach of these decrees. They weren't just about controlling what women wore or where they walked. This so-called law and order the Taliban provided was the ultimate threat of violent authority. For major infractions of these decrees, like accusations of adultery, also though how one defines adultery is in the eyes of the accuser, the punishment included public executions and death by stoning. I also want to highlight some other decrees made by the Taliban during this time to really cement the extent in which they impacted the lives of the Afghan people. Women caught wearing nail polish could have their fingers cut off. Women were banned from laughing loudly because no stranger was supposed to hear a woman's voice. They were also forbidden from wearing high-heeled shoes so that men would not hear their footsteps and become aroused. The Taliban mandated the renaming of all places that included the word women, changing places like Women's Garden to Spring Garden. Beyond the burqa, women were specifically banned from wearing flared or wide-legged pants underneath their burqa, and they could not wear brightly colored clothes either, because the Taliban deemed them sexually attracting. Are you seeing a pattern here? As discussed in the last episode, women were banned from being outside of their house without a mahram, a male family member. An oddly specific decree was a ban on keeping or playing with pigeons. Violators faced imprisonment, and the birds were killed. After further researching this, I learned that it was because of the gambling associated with pigeons. Apparently, the Taliban thought that if you were playing with birds in any way, you were not thinking about God. They also banned kite flying. So every time a woman was whipped for a, quote, modesty violation, or a man was punished for not growing his beard, a constant suffocating feeling of fear and hypervigilance was created. By the way, there was another very specific law for this that said a man's beard had to be long enough to be able to clasp his beard with a fist and have it come out the other end. The Taliban took the existing, already flawed structures of Sharia jurisprudence and weaponized it to ensure that no Afghan, man or woman, could ever really feel safe outside of their home. Now, one of the primary forms of nonviolent resistance at the time was a publication called Payam-e-Azan, or Women's Message, run covertly by RAWA, as I pointed out in the beginning of the episode. The publication was created by Mina, RAWA's founder, in 1981, and it functioned by its members smuggling out eyewitness reports, photos, and personal stories from all across the country. Reading through these reports is crazy, to see so many different accounts of the experiences of the Afghan people. Knowing how dangerous these acts were, just orally reporting on these different things was absolutely punishable by the worst things you can imagine. But they did it anyway. And also, through these publications, one can see that the Taliban's repression wasn't just about political edicts and decrees. It invaded the smallest, most mundane details of everyday life, too. On one end, you had bizarre micro-enforcement, religious police walking around with scissors to publicly clip men's hair, not the beard though, of course, or cut the trousers of passersby if they didn't meet strict length requirements. In one report from Kabul, a man was arrested simply for humming a song while riding his bicycle. In another incident near a cinema, Taliban officers stopped a married couple in public, slapped the husband, and screamed at him because his wife's trousers were slightly visible beneath her burqa. The irony wasn't lost on locals either. The regime officially banned people from keeping caged birds, all while restricting women inside the four walls of their homes. Such a strange thing over birds. I actually think it might also have to do with music, because, music was banned and certain birds sing. So also, in addition to perceived problems with gambling, it was also definitely about music, because there are many birds that are known as songbirds and they kind of sing. But Payam-e-Zan also documented how quickly this absurd power tripping turned violent. Local commanders regularly demanded young girls for forced marriages. One documented story involved a young woman named Shakiba who drank poison to escape being handed over to a local commander. By the way, reading Payam-e-Zan is something I recommend. It is a wild experience because its prose is heavily rooted in the 1970s left-wing revolutionary press tradition. Influenced by anti-imperialist and Maoist political rhetoric, the publication uses super uncompromising vocabulary, constantly denouncing, quote, reactionary fundamentalists, lackeys, and foreign puppets. This creates a unique style that blends eyewitness reporting with the fiery tone of a revolutionary political manifesto. You can find it in the show notes. Also, just so it's known, RAWA's reporting wasn't limited to the Taliban. They had previously documented the equal brutality by the warlords, who later made up the Northern Alliance. During the Second Civil War in Kabul, forces of warlord factions such as Hezb-e-Wadat, in addition to many, many others, committed severe atrocities. Payam-e-Zan reported on mass graves unearthed around Kabul University, containing the bodies of civilians that had been buried alive, also documented not only by RAWA, but also different human rights organizations, were the many home invasions where militia fighters murdered families and sexually assaulted women. In one widely reported case in a Kabul apartment complex, fundamentalist militiamen broke into a family home and killed all of the male relatives. The 16-year-old girl that was left in the home jumped to her death from a high-rise window rather than submit to sexual violence. So, one can see that for many everyday citizens, the problem remained the same. Armed fundamentalists ruling by force. But the Taliban also targeted different groups of people that did not practice Sunni Islam. Another decree that they had was that anyone who converted from Islam to another religion was to be executed, and non-Muslim minorities such as Hazaras were forced to stitch a yellow cloth onto their clothing to distinguish them from the Muslim majority. That sounds fascistly familiar. When the Taliban captured the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif in August 1998, remember, they never fully had control of the northern region of Afghanistan. They carried out one of the worst massacres of the entire conflict. Over a period of several days, Taliban fighters went home to home and shot thousands of Hazara men and boys, leaving bodies in the street for days to rot because residents were forbidden from burying them. Human rights groups estimate between 2,000 and 8,000 civilians were murdered. And just like you'd think would happen with a regime such as this, a totalitarian theocracy, they, to this day, deny having ever committed any massacre or ethnic cleansing, going so far even as to claim that their enemies have been staging these atrocities that have been filmed time and time again by journalists. They just deny and dismiss allegations and accusations. Like, who? Us? No, that was the other guys. So yeah, false flag narratives are even popular amongst the Taliban. They also stormed the Iranian consulate in Mazar-e-Sharif and executed 8 Iranian diplomats, nearly plunging Iran and Taliban-ruled Afghanistan into a full-scale war. And I almost forgot to mention, in May 1996, just a few years prior to all this, an unfortunately familiar figure re-entered the Afghan scene. Osama bin Laden returned from exile in Sudan, landing at the airport in Jalalabad. You see, bin Laden first went to Pakistan and Afghanistan in the early 1980s as a young, wealthy Saudi donor. He had helped fund and organize foreign Arab volunteer fighters fighting against the Soviet occupation. Toward the end of the war in 1988, bin Laden created al-Qaeda in Peshawar in eastern Afghanistan as an organization for these veteran fighters. After Soviet troops withdrew in 1989, bin Laden left Afghanistan and returned home to Saudi Arabia. He had been in exile in Sudan due to his anger that non-Muslim American troops were invited by the Saudi government for protection during the 1990 invasion of Kuwait. These troops had been stationed near Islam's holy sites, such as Mecca, which really seemed to burn bin Laden's ass, to the point that he publicly denounced the Saudi royal family and was thus stripped of his Saudi citizenship, which is where the exile came in. While al-Qaeda and the Taliban shared a radical fundamentalist way of thinking, their ultimate goals were pretty different. The Taliban operated primarily as a national movement, focused on enforcing their strict interpretation of Sharia and consolidating power within Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda, by contrast, operated as a transnational network with more global ambitions. By late 1996, the Taliban offered bin Laden protection and safe haven, formalizing a partnership where al-Qaeda provided financial resources, foreign fighters, and military training in exchange for sanctuary. This alliance strengthened the Taliban's military capability as they pushed north to break the resistance held by Massoud's Northern Alliance forces. So now, back to where we were in the timeline. In August 1999, as fighting intensified across the Shomali Plain north of Kabul, the Taliban went scorched earth. They burned whole villages, dynamited centuries-old irrigation networks, and destroyed agricultural fields and vineyards to starve out the civilian population, thus throwing a wrench into the support networks for the Northern Alliance soldiers. During the absolute chaos that ensued, the Taliban, heavily reinforced by thousands of allied Arab and Pakistani foreign fighters linked to al-Qaeda, carried out systematic mass abductions of women and young girls. As families fled the burning of their villages and fields, Taliban forces separated hundreds of young Tajik and ethnic minority women from their fleeing relatives. Eyewitness testimonies gathered by Human Rights Watch and RAWA revealed that these women were loaded into trucks and buses and then transported to detention centers in Jalalabad and Kabul. From there, hundreds of girls were trafficked into Pakistan and the Gulf states, where they were forced into sexual slavery or distributed to Taliban commanders and foreign fighters as spoils of war for forced marriages. The United Nations Special Report on Violence Against Women officially denounced these atrocities in September 1999, categorizing them as institutionalized human rights abuses. the vast majority of the missing Somali women were never found. So, the scale of the humanitarian crisis throughout Afghanistan was captured on the ground by documentarian Saira Shah in Beneath the Veil. In the markets of Kabul, she filmed women with starving children grinding up moldy bread that was being sold as animal feed, just to keep their families from starving. With a complete ban on women working outside the home and male breadwinners often killed or imprisoned, women without financial support had to scrape by through whatever means necessary. This could mean the selling off of possessions or even begging in the street. Another consequence of catastrophic poverty is women being forced into survival sex work through underground networks, where the risk of being caught for this is more likely than not death. Shah also pointed out that during this era, Afghanistan had one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the whole world. Now, this has a lot to do with needing a mahram to be outside the home. And while urban women in cities like Kabul faced strict house arrest and constant public policing, pregnancy was uniquely deadly for women in rural areas. With the professional medical infrastructure completely dismantled, female doctors banned, and women forbidden from being treated by male physicians, pregnant women in remote villages had virtually no access to healthcare or midwives during childbirth, forcing them to face medical emergencies entirely alone. But even with all of this happening, the Afghan people, and women in particular, still refused to lay down and surrender, to give up. Through organizations like RAWA, women participated in covert forms of resistance across different areas of Afghanistan. When the regime banned female education past age 8, women continued the dangerous practice of underground homeschools in private living rooms, hiding textbooks under rugs, furniture, wherever they would fit whenever morality police patrolled the streets. They operated underground beauty salons behind those blacked-out windows, preserving spaces for community and some sense of normalcy. And as discussed in the beginning of the episode, activists risked public beatings and execution by concealing small cameras under their burqas to secretly film the Taliban's crimes, smuggling the footage out to reveal the reality of life under this regime to the outside world. The secret camera operation run by RAWA required a ton of planning. They did it by cutting tiny slits in the heavy mesh of their burqas to expose camera lenses, recording public floggings, amputations, and even executions in locations like the one I described in the beginning of the episode at Ghazi Stadium. The physical videotapes were then smuggled across the border into Pakistan, where other members digitized and distributed them to international news outlets and human rights organizations. These efforts actually depended heavily on male relatives and allies. As we know, under Taliban law, a woman could not leave her home alone without a mahram. Husbands, brothers, and sons acted as physical escorts for women traveling to hidden classrooms or underground beauty salons. Male collaborators also assisted in printing and transporting thousands of copies of Payam-e-Ehsan. When caught by Taliban or rival jihadi intelligence units, these men faced severe torture, long imprisonment in the panopticon-looking prison Pul-e-Sharki, or execution. In late February 2001, Mullah Muhammad Omar, the leader of the Taliban, ordered the destruction of all non-Islamic statues in Afghanistan. The decree briefly caught the attention of the international community, which triggered frantic diplomatic appeals to the Taliban. The world was finally paying some attention to Afghanistan, but not in the way one would have hoped, which should have been because of the humanitarian crisis ongoing. Subsequently, the Taliban blew up the 1,500-year-old giant Buddha statues in Bamiyan with dynamite. Global leaders and legacy media outlets issued immediate, widespread condemnations. And look, RAWA loudly pointed out what they viewed as huge international hypocrisy. While acknowledging the loss of cultural heritage, they noted that the global community showed far more outrage over ancient stone statues than over the extreme starvation, displacement, and outright murder of living Afghan citizens over the last 5 years. On September 9, 2001, just 2 days before 9/11, al-Qaeda carried out a targeted assassination in northern Afghanistan. 2 suicide operatives posing as Moroccan journalists gained access to the leader of the Northern Alliance, Ahmad Shah Massoud's military headquarters in Takhar province. During a scheduled interview, they detonated a bomb hidden inside their video camera. Massoud died from his injuries shortly after. For the Northern Alliance, Massoud's death was devastating. After all, he was the primary military strategist, holding the anti-Taliban coalition together. In fact, his inner circle knew just how catastrophic this news would be. So they did what any other coalition would do. They tried to keep his assassination a complete secret for days. They smuggled his body north toward Tajikistan, using code words on satellite phones, hiding his death from their very own fighters out of fear that the front lines would panic and completely collapse once they found out. Also, without him, the remaining resistance forces faced the possibility of total defeat, which meant that the Taliban could take full control over the country. Now, for Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, the assassination served a dual purpose. It took out basically their only battlefield opponent. Yes, the Northern Alliance were also at war with al-Qaeda due to their funding of the Taliban. The assassination also delivered a kind of gift to Mullah Omar right before al-Qaeda launched the 9/11 attacks. I mean, it was a pretty calculated move to secure the Taliban's loyalty when the United States would inevitably come looking for them. With Massoud gone, the defense line of the North was kind of fucked, leaving the remaining anti-Taliban forces completely vulnerable. For civilians, especially women who had survived 5 years of hell under the regime, the future was looking pretty bleak. And then, just 2 days later, the world changed within a matter of hours. Now, because the Taliban had Taliban TV, and restricted media, no one watched the towers fall live or anything like that on 9/11. But they could listen to it. Because the Taliban hadn't outlawed radio, they couldn't. They needed it to pump indoctrination and rules into the people. They used it as a psychological tool to enforce total obedience through their radio station. Get ready for this one. Voice of Sharia. Sounds like nightmare fuel. Anyway, the population was also permitted to listen to stations like the BBC in the Pashto or Dari language, mostly because you can't, block out only certain stations. So, in many rural areas, people heard secondhand reports about attacks on skyscrapers, but didn't know what a skyscraper was. Which, makes sense. The initial reaction was pretty much just pure confusion. But once the connection to Osama bin Laden became clear, since everyone knew he was living openly as the Taliban's guest, the reality of how serious the situation was became clear. The Americans were coming. By September 13th, panic was spreading across cities like Kabul and Kandahar. People already knew from decades of war that when a foreign superpower turns its sights on Afghanistan, it meant bombings. The Taliban intensified their rules in anticipation of whatever was coming, and families found themselves scrambling. And it turns out that the Taliban did not throw reason to the dogs, because the corruption was always right at their feet. And now, also in their relations with al-Qaeda. They panicked and were in total denial about bin Laden being responsible. They tried to stall, but in reality, just like the Afghan people, they knew what was most likely coming. Amid all the chaos, RAWA released a statement that was pretty brutal on September 14, 2001. They opened by expressing genuine sorrow for the innocent civilian lives lost in the US attacks, making it clear that Afghan citizens had nothing to do with bin Laden and his network. But then they did a hard turn and pointed out the massive hypocrisy of Western foreign policy. They reminded the world that for years, Western powers had funded and armed these exact same fundamentalist factions during the Soviet war when it suited their geopolitical goals. Also in the statement, the organization warned that the US had ignored their past warnings, and now the fire that foreign powers had been fanning was burning everyone. They also unfortunately accurately predicted that a US bombing campaign wouldn't hit the terrorists hiding in the mountains. It would end up hurting the civilian population, particularly women and children, who were already trapped at the bottom. And it is with the Women of Afghanistan during the War on Terror and Taliban 2.0 that we will pick back up with next episode, for the third and final part of this series. As always, thank you so much for listening. And also, please follow and rate the show. Any feedback is always appreciated. And don't forget, stay vigilant, stay vocal, because silence is complicity. See you next time.